The story of Matthew, the tax collector turned apostle of Jesus, is full of change and hope. He was seen as a traitor by his people and lived isolated, rejected by everyone. But everything changed the day Jesus called him with just 2 words: "Follow me." Matthew left his old life behind and began a new journey, which transformed him into a follower of Christ and the author of one of the Gospels that still inspires people around the world today. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a "thanks a lot." And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Matthew was born amid the hills of Galilee, a region teeming with life and conflict. It was a land marked by its bustling villages, the sparkle of Lake Gennesaret in the sun, and the scent of olive trees that swayed in the wind. But it was also a scenario of oppression, where the Jewish people lived under the yoke of the Roman Empire, fighting to preserve their identity and their faith. Matthew grew up in this environment, where dreams often clashed with the harsh reality of an unfair world. At a young age, Matthew found a path that offered him financial security, but at the cost of a destroyed reputation. He became a tax collector. It was not a choice that pleased his countrymen. Publicans like him were seen as traitors, collaborators with the enemy, who enriched themselves at the expense of the suffering of their own brothers. There was always a whisper of suspicion as he passed through the streets, and looks of contempt followed him like shadows. Yet there was something about Matthew that seemed accustomed to isolation. Perhaps he had accepted the idea that wealth would buy his peace, even if it didn't bring love or respect. He sat at the tax office, counting coins under the watchful eyes of Roman guards, while he heard murmurs of prayers and protests in the distance. He was a man who seemed to have everything, but at the same time, he possessed nothing. The coins that jingled on his table represented more than wealth. They were like small mirrors that reflected his loneliness and an emptiness that he perhaps didn't know how to name. Day after day, he remained there, surrounded by numbers and disapproving looks. Matthew lived stuck in a meticulously calculated routine. Every morning, he set up his table at the collector's office, adjusted the parchments and counting instruments, as if he wanted to give his work an appearance of order that did not exist in his soul. From his position, he saw the movement of the market, traders discussing prices, children running between the stalls, and every now and then he heard someone whisper his name as if it were an insult. He knew what they thought of him: traitor, burglar, man without faith. The work of tax collector was not just an occupation, but a burden he carried, aware that he was despised by those he should call brothers. It was true that many publicans stole to enrich themselves, taking advantage of their position, but Matthew no longer knew whether his honesty mattered. In the eyes of the people, he was just another servant of Rome, someone who did not deserve forgiveness or compassion. Still, Matthew continued, day after day, dealing with coins stained with sweat and tears. Each piece of silver that slid across his desk seemed to weigh more than the last. He watched the tense faces of those handing over their sustenance, and as much as he tried to ignore it, something inside him protested. It was as if a voice, still small and almost inaudible, asked him, how long? There were nights when he couldn't sleep. In his home, surrounded by silence, Matthew wondered if he would ever have a different life. He didn't know if what he felt was regret or just tiredness, but there was something there, an uneasiness that he couldn't shake. He watched the moonlight shine on his coins, feeling that no matter how much he accumulated riches, his soul remained empty. Until one day, while Matthew was organizing the records at the tax office, and the morning sun came through the small window, illuminating the piles of coins he had gathered, he heard firm footsteps that echoed down the street, approaching his table. Matthew looked up and saw a man he knew by name but had never met before. It was Jesus. Jesus was not like the others. His gaze carried neither judgment nor contempt. Rather, there was a depth that Matthew could not decipher. It was as if, in a single moment, the man before him saw everything, his mistakes, his choices, his loneliness, and yet he remained there without moving away. Matthew felt a strange heat in his chest, a mixture of discomfort and hope, as if something was about to break inside him. Then bluntly Jesus spoke. His voice was calm, but carried with an authority that seemed not to belong to this world. He said just 2 words, "Follow me," nothing more. There were no long speeches, no explanations. Just a simple, direct, and somehow irresistible invitation. Matthew was paralyzed for a moment. He could hear the sound of his heart beating, the murmur of the merchants outside, and even the clink of a coin that rolled from the table to the floor. And there, at that moment, everything changed. Matthew got up, leaving behind the parchments, the coins, the records, everything he knew and that had defined his life until then. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. It was as if that sentence had ripped away the invisible chains that tied him to that table. When he took the first step to follow Jesus, he wasn't sure where he was going, but he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Matthew, now free from the chains that tied him to the collector's office, took the next step that seemed natural to him. He decided to open the doors of his house for a great banquet. It was not just a meal, but a gesture full of meaning. He invited all those who, like him, were rejected by society: tax collectors, sinners, people who lived on the margins, carrying the weight of their own mistakes and the judgments of others. It was as if Matthew wanted to share the beginning of his new life with those who needed to hear about it most. The house, which had previously been silent and heavy, was soon filled with voices, shy laughter, and the aroma of food being served. The guests arrived, exchanging uncertain looks. After all, it wasn't every day that someone like Matthew, known for his coldness and distance, called them to a banquet. But there they were, sitting side by side, chatting while Jesus, the main guest, occupied the place of honor. There was something extraordinary about that scene. Jesus was there, surrounded by people who, for many, did not deserve attention or mercy. The Pharisees, watching from afar, could not hide their indignation. They murmured among themselves, questioning how this man who proclaimed himself a master could share the table with sinners. But Jesus, with his usual calmness, responded in a way that silenced the criticism. "The healthy do not need a doctor, but the sick do. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." These words hovered over the room, penetrating hearts and leaving an impact that no one there would forget. Matthew looked at all of this in silence, as if he were witnessing something sacred. The presence of Jesus transformed not only the environment, but also the people. The hardened faces began to relax, the voices became more confident, and something almost palpable filled the air: hope. The banquet was a milestone, but what came after was even more unexpected. Matthew, who until a few days ago was just another tax collector, now walked alongside Jesus, learning, listening, seeing miracles happen before his eyes. The transformation that had begun with that simple call, "Follow me," seemed to gain more strength every day. However, he had no idea what would come next. One morning, as the group followed their usual path along the dusty roads of Galilee, Jesus called the closest disciples to him. With words that carried unquestionable authority, he began to announce something that would change the course of Matthew's life forever. It was time to choose 12 men. 12 who would be more than disciples. They would be apostles, sent to take the message of the kingdom to all corners. Matthew heard his name being called. There was no fanfare, just the quiet voice of Jesus. But the weight of what those words meant fell upon him like a thunderbolt. Matthew, the publican, the despised man, the sinner who could barely lift his eyes to heaven, was now part of that tight circle. He wasn't sure what that entailed, but there was an unmistakable certainty. His life would never be the same. He looked around, seeing the other chosen ones, fishermen, simple workers, men of all sorts. There were no scholars or religious leaders in the group, just ordinary people like him. This choice seemed to carry a symbolism that did not go unnoticed. Jesus did not see the appearances, the flaws, or the labels that the world placed. He saw the heart and potential of each person. As he followed Jesus, the responsibility of the new role began to weigh on Matthew's shoulders. He was anxious, but also hopeful. After all, he wasn't just one of the group. He was an apostle, someone who should be prepared to take the message of the kingdom to places he could not even imagine. And deep down, I knew that this preparation was just beginning. The days with Jesus were a mix of constant learning and challenges that seemed to grow with each step. Matthew, who previously spent his time on calculations and tax records, now used his eyes and ears for something completely different, absorbing every word, every teaching of the Master. But even though he was immersed in this new life, he couldn't ignore a thought that popped into his mind frequently. There was something he knew how to do well, something that for a long time was his livelihood tool: writing. It was common for Matthew to mentally record the moments he spent with Jesus. He had a keen eye for details, such as the sparkle of hope in the eyes of healed people, or the way Jesus, with a simple parable, transformed the understanding of multitudes. It was as if he felt that these memories were not just for him, but that they needed to be preserved for something greater. It was then that the idea began to take shape. Matthew was not just an apostle, he would also be a chronicler. He decided to put the events, words, and gestures he witnessed on paper, not just as a personal memory, but as a message to all who would come after him. His style was precise, but also deeply human. He knew he was not just narrating facts, but conveying life, hope, and the promise of something much greater. Matthew began to organize his thoughts and connect the events he witnessed with the teachings of the Scriptures. It was amazing how everything made sense, from the ancient prophecies to the actions and words of Jesus. The skill he had used to record numbers now served to tell the most important story he had ever known. Matthias wrote with dedication, but his purpose went far beyond recording stories. He knew that his people, the Jews, needed to see something that he himself had discovered. Jesus was the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of all the prophecies that had resonated since the times of Abraham and David. Every word he placed on the parchment was chosen with care, as if he were sewing a sacred fabric, linking the past to the present in a way that no one could ignore. He began his narrative in a way that his compatriots would immediately recognize, with a genealogy. But it wasn't just any list of names. It was a golden line that traced the lineage of Jesus to Abraham, the father of faith, through David, the king whose descendants carried the promise of an eternal throne. It was as if Matthew was holding a mirror up to his people, showing them that everything they had hoped for was right in front of them. With each page, Matthew connected the events of Jesus' life with the Scriptures that the Jews knew so well. He remembered the words of the prophets, the promises of salvation, and showed how they were realized in simple gestures, such as the healing of a blind man, or in grandiose events, such as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He did this not only with accuracy, but with passion, because he knew that this message needed to reach the most hardened hearts. But it wasn't just the content that was impressive, it was the way Matthew wrote. He had a talent for creating vivid images, for painting with words the scenes he saw with his own eyes. When he spoke of Jesus walking on the water or multiplying the loaves, it was as if the reader were there, feeling the wind on his face, or holding a piece of the blessed bread. This skill made his narrative more than a story. It was an invitation to live those experiences. As Matthew deepened his work, the days spent together with the other apostles and Jesus became more intense. The mission was taking on new contours, expanding beyond Israel's borders. As time passed, Matthew and the other apostles realized that Jesus' mission was greater than any of them could imagine. What had begun in the villages of Galilee now echoed across distant lands. After Christ's ascension, Matthew, like the other apostles, received a clear calling to take the message of the kingdom of God to the ends of the earth. It was a huge, almost impossible challenge, but they knew they were not alone. The Holy Spirit guided them. For Matthias, leaving his homeland was not an easy decision. He grew up among the fields and hills of Galilee. He knew the people and their stories. But his heart burned with the desire to share what he had learned, to reach those who had never heard of Jesus. Christian tradition says that Matthew traveled to distant lands, taking the gospel to unknown peoples. There is talk of trips to Ethiopia, Persia, and even other parts of the Middle East. In each place he went, Matthias encountered new challenges. The languages were different, the cultures were strange, and he was often greeted with suspicion. But that didn't stop him. He spoke with the same passion with which he had written. He connected ancient prophecies with the life of Jesus, showed the impact of the Master's words, and above all, let his actions speak louder than any speech. Matthias was known for his calm and persistence. He not only preached to large crowds, but also sat with the simplest, sharing a meal, listening to their stories, and patiently showing them what it meant to follow the way of Christ. Wherever he went, he carried with him the certainty that his mission was to plant seeds, even if he never saw the fruits grow. These journeys, marked by dangers and sacrifices, further shaped Matthew's heart. He felt that he was fully living the calling he had received. Matthew's travels took him to places he would never have imagined visiting. I walked along dusty roads, crossed unknown valleys, and navigated rivers that cut through exotic landscapes. At each stop, I encountered new faces and stories, people carrying their own burdens and hopes. He told them about Jesus, not just as someone who preached a new religion, but as someone who brought life, healing, and redemption. Matthew knew his message was more than words. It was a living promise. With each village he left, Matthias carried with him the marks of his mission. It was not always received with joy. There were moments of persecution, threats, and rejection. However, he never backed down. His words echoed in the hearts of some, and that was enough. Even in the most difficult times, he felt the presence of Christ at his side, strengthening him to continue. But time passed, and the signs of fatigue began to be felt in his body. The long journeys and the weight of the mission took their toll. Still, Matthias never thought about giving up. He knew that his life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the one who had called it. With every step, he carried the memory of Jesus' look on the day it all began, a look that transformed him and gave him purpose. Details about Matthew's last days are shrouded in mystery. Some say he died in foreign lands, martyred for his faith, while others believe he rested in peace after years of service. What is certain is that his work, both written and lived, left profound marks. The gospel he wrote continued to resonate, touching lives, just as his words and actions had touched so many people along his journey. Matthew's life seemed to be summed up in a powerful contrast, like a mosaic that only reveals itself completely when seen from a distance. From a despised, isolated, and judgmental tax collector, he became one of the 12 pillars of the most transformative mission the world had ever known. Every moment of his journey reflected what Jesus did best, taking the unlikely and transforming it into the extraordinary. Imagining Matthew in his final years is like visualizing the outcome of a story that never really ends. He may have been sitting, his skin marked by the sun from long journeys and his eyes tired, but still shining with the same passion that had moved him since the day he heard the call. The hands that once counted coins now held the parchment where his words took shape, words that not only recorded a story, but that would live forever in the hearts of those who read them. Matthew never sought glory or recognition. The brilliance of his journey was in his total commitment. He exchanged fleeting riches for eternal treasure, He stopped weighing other people's debts to talk about the one who paid the biggest debt of all. His story was not just about a change of profession or place, but about a transformation of identity, from sinner to grace-bearer. Matthew's last images can be imagined as a living metaphor, a man who walked with his head held high, not out of pride, but out of the certainty that his life now had a greater purpose. And while time and circumstances led him to the end of his earthly journey, his work, his gospel, and his example continued, like a river that never dries, feeding the souls of all who seek to understand the power of a calling. Matthew's story does not end with the last page of his gospel or with the account of his mission. She is still alive, pulsating in each lesson that her trajectory teaches us. Looking at the life of this apostle is seeing more than just one man. It is to see the power of an encounter with Christ. Matthew shows us that no matter who we were or what we did, God's grace is capable of transforming any life. Every choice Matthew made after that call, "Follow me," reflects the courage to abandon what was comfortable, even if imperfect, to embrace the unknown, fully trusting in the voice of Jesus. He teaches us about the strength of leaving behind not only material goods, but also internal barriers, guilt, fear, the label that the world insists on placing. On his journey, Matthew not only found a new identity, he became an instrument so that others could also be transformed. Matthew's legacy is like a beacon, lighting the way for those who feel unworthy or trapped in the past. His gospel is not just a record of Christ's deeds, but a testimony that God uses ordinary, imperfect people to accomplish extraordinary things. Matthew reminds us that Christ's mission is not exclusive to the strong or those who seem most prepared. He chooses those with willing hearts, those who, like Matthew, dare to rise from the table of their own limitations. And so, at the end of his story, what remains is a simple but profound truth. No matter the starting point, what really counts is the destination to which God's call leads us. Matthew inspires us to listen to this call, to trust in transformation, and to follow the path, knowing that, like him, we can become part of something much bigger than ourselves. If you liked Matthew's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.